Well, first and foremost, the rolling start was stolen from my channel, which is stolen from Joe Rogan, but he went to Spotify, so that doesn't count. But to answer your question, I have been trying to, as a result of trying to get away from the woke and the loony left, as you just put it, I've found myself gearing myself towards less confrontational conversations online anyway, in terms of these streams. And you are probably well aware, I don't know if the audience would be aware, that I have had various different conversations with very crazy people, including one man who got fired from another man that tried to sue me for a six-figure sum. So these sorts of conversations. Oh, that was John Richards and Lance Graychuk. Yeah.
Wow.
And that was fun. Yeah, because they had that conference with Dawkins getting a Lifetime Achievement Award from Krauss. And for those who don't know, that particular podcast was, in short, one of the co-organizers on my podcast, and he was promoting this event. And after an hour, he said, "You're not asking hard enough questions." And so I said, "Is it right to platform Lawrence Krauss given these sexual assault allegations?" Just a basic neutral question, wasn't giving my perspective. And the next 5 to 10 minutes is probably the YouTube gold that I was waiting for. He just defended sexual assault as a concept. Said he was going to run his hand up my leg at his conference. All sorts of very sort of wild behaviour that then, quote unquote, got him fired. But then we found out later on that he still had access to the conference emails because he emailed me, probably by accident. And then the other co-organizer was constantly asked about this and said, "Well, we don't really trust you. You've clearly not taken this guy out who's making a big thing about funding this event. He's still involved, clearly." So that event fell apart mainly because of COVID, but he blamed me. And in over 2 letters, he said that's a very high 5-figure sum, and then a second letter, maybe a 6-figure sum. I don't know where he's getting these numbers from. But their tickets for their event were like $1,000 to meet
Jesus.
and greet.
We actually were going to have him on the podcast until we found out that that happened. We had no idea, but he was coming on.
He's still being questioned by Seamus at Free Thought Profit. They've still got a bit of a sort of ding dong between them. Anyway, sorry, the question itself. Sorry, SE. So yeah, I tried to get into street epistemology mainly because it's always been very, very much my style. I don't have the temperament to do those debates. I'm much more, as you probably well know, I don't come forward as a personality. I don't think I do. And I really like asking questions in a Socratic manner. So that'd be quite interesting to get some flat earthers on, to get some, whoever thinks they, could get a particularly prominent individual to talk to me about their ideas, and they could just spread their ideas, explain what they think. They'll get a platform from me, and in a sense, it's demonstrating how to deal with these people to people who think we shouldn't be platforming them.
The platforming question has always been interesting for me, especially when it comes to those sorts of conspiracy theories. I was thinking about this when I was watching the recent Destiny podcast that he had with Nick Fuentes, who is a far-right groyper, theocrat. And so he believes that the official story is far from the truth when it comes to 9/11. And so this video is going to be demonetized. But anyways, the thing with conspiracy theorists is that they have so much random information that you can't keep track of it, because obviously not everyone is going to be able to. Sam Harris worded it well on his podcast when he was asked why wasn't he platforming Brett Weinstein when it came to the vaccines. And he said, well, because there's just so much information that it's difficult to navigate through. you really need to do an analysis after that podcast and then look at all the arguments that were made, all the claims that were made, and look at them there. Because if someone just like randomly says something like, "Oh, well, what do you think about the fact that 11 pediatricians were fired because they, or something random," and probably, what do you make of that? And Sam's be like, "Well, I don't know. I didn't know that." There's so many things like that, and so for someone watching, it comes across as if the conspiracy theorist is the one who looks better, who's winning, because he's bringing up points that the other person, the oppositional side, doesn't even know about. But they don't know about it because they're ill-informed. They don't know about it because there's just so much information, and you really can't be expected to have a grapple on enough knowledge to be able to counter argue against every single little individual instance that the conspiracy theorist might offer. So that's why that platforming question has always interested me. Obviously, if it's if two people have an equal amount of knowledge but just different perspective, 100% have that debate and platform it. I've always been against the idea of deplatforming. Certainly got angry when Armin was deplatformed from Oxford, got angry when Dawkins was deplatformed from Berkeley. But that there is that concern, though, certainly, that the other person just can look better by virtue of just shooting random stuff, throw enough stuff at the wall, something will stick. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that sort of stipulation about the platforming thing that I have?
Yeah, so on that basis, just very quickly, I'm going to have to replace this earpiece. I don't know why it's not charged. I left it uncharged, but there we are. So I'll leave, while I run off, I'll leave Bruce to answer as well. But just very briefly, this is why street epistemology is important, because I'm not addressing each individual claim. I'm addressing the epistemology as to why you believe in that claim. And so if that claim is fallacious and be look into the fallacies and biases that I write about, then you can look at something like Gish Gallop, as you were touching upon, where you're just bombarding the other person with lots of different arguments. You then strip that back and you say, okay, what's your best argument? And then you're only dealing with one. And if you do defeat that argument, you've defeated their best argument, as it were.
You want to pare it down.
I'd like to, yeah.
You want to pare it down.
I'd like to run off. Sorry.
Sure.
Carry on.
So I think what Dave was saying is like, let's cut right to the chase. Like, don't bring up just like they can bring up all these random ideas and supposed points to reinforce whatever point they want to make, and we want to be able to cut to the chase as to what is being argued. But that is something that does bother me, because I mean, I'm sympathetic to the idea that you can have someone ask a bunch of what if this happened, what if that happened scenario, and they throw everything at a board. And if the other person is not in a position to answer and refute each and every single one of these claims, then it becomes a war of attrition. The person who is trying to sneak in the most volume of points, to the extent they have any, ends up looking good, and in some cases much in a position much more to be believed than the other person. What I have a problem with, though, is that what if the other person who is raising all these tangential points has some basis in validity? Should any of those be taken seriously? What if there is something that does need to be addressed inside there? How do you differentiate between someone who is, or let me rephrase that. How do you differentiate between someone just throwing out a bunch of random points, trying to score, and opposed to someone who's throwing out a mess, but there's something inside there that does really drive their thesis home? Should we have a dialogue addressing that? And one more caveat I think we should consider is that our institutions have lost a lot of trust during the COVID crisis. So how do you approach truth in this kind of circumstance and in this kind of environment?
Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of the times there's going to be a kernel of truth in a lot of the scattershot information that people are giving. And the issue, it's a difficult issue. And even if you're in a combative debate where you're trying to win the argument, I think even in that instance, as Dave was saying, street epistemology could be effective, not just for that particular instance. It sort of cuts through all the unnecessary information that is being thrown out, and you can sort of extract, hopefully, that kernel of truth if you're skilled enough, because it's very difficult to actually use street epistemology effectively. And that's always been interesting for me. About half the people that I use street epistemology on get annoyed with it, and then the other half are more than open to exploring their own beliefs. And what I've noticed is that, one, the Dunning-Kruger effect is 100% true, or at the very least 99% true. But and a lot of and this is, David was mentioning this before we started recording, where what if we were to show people give us their confidence level. So in street epistemology, a quick synopsis of how it works is that many people, at least first, like Reed Nicewinder, our friend, and Anthony Magnabosco. So what they'll do is they'll ask a question, right? Or say to the person they're interviewing, what would you like to talk about, right? What is a belief that you hold that you're pretty confident about? And so most of the time people will say their belief in their God, or whatever it may be. But usually it's like a belief in God. And so Anthony Magnabosco or Reed Nicewinder or whoever it is will say, well, okay, so from 0 to a 10 or 0 to 100, on this little meter, how confident are you? And then a lot of people will usually put like 95% confident, like 100% confident. Right? Then they undergo the process of interrogating those beliefs, not in a combative way. I shouldn't have said interrogated, but rather ask them questions about their beliefs, like how do you know this is true? What would it take for you to change your mind? Questions that forces the person to understand themselves better and understand why they believe what they believe. And almost invariably, towards the end, their confidence level decreases because they realize they were never near as confident as they originally thought they were. And so this goes into the Dunning-Kruger effect, which I think David can explain it a million times better than me. So I'm going to go ahead and pass the speaking stick over to him.
Sure, well carried. Yeah, I don't know what was going on there. Just refused to join the earpiece connect the earpiece for a second. Sorry, yeah. So Dunning-Kruger compares somebody's confidence with their knowledge, and you can do this by just simply asking somebody what their confidence level is, as a street epistemologist would, and typically the graph is denoted by 4 different areas, really, but maybe 5 at the very beginning. So the very beginning is, if you don't know anything, you aren't very confident at all. You typically admit that you know nothing if you know nothing. Say myself, about astrophysicists and their work, I have absolutely no idea. I wouldn't know. If you know a little bit, like how much I know about Andrew Tate, or maybe that'll demonetize us. I've seen like nothing of him, relatively speaking, but I think I know enough, right, to be 100% confident in my conviction that he is a bit of a knob. So as soon as I start to learn a little bit more, my confidence level then plummets completely to its almost lowest level. So you have this peak of Mount Stupid and this valley of despair, and that only takes a very small amount of knowledge to go from the top straight down to the bottom. But once you're at the bottom, it's a very long, arduous process to go back up the slope of enlightenment, I think it's called, up to the plateau of sustainability. It's got little names, but essentially what that means is this path on that we're on to become masters of whatever we're doing starts with knowing nothing, being very confident, being basically ruined by our arrogance, and then we start to see, okay, there's a lot that we don't know. Let's now investigate and actually try and find and acquire knowledge. And it's always seemed like, particularly in the early days, particularly like Bogosian level of street epistemology, it's always been about faith. So going back to that example that you were giving, about, let's say some Christian gives you 8 reasons why they believe a particular claim, and you can't really address all of them, and you don't know whether they're being sincere or not. Maybe 5 of those claims are based on faith as their foundation. And so if you can take out that little piece of reasoning, that epistemology, that faith, then more than like half their argument falls apart, and then they start to go down the slope. So that peak going down to the valley, that part of the graph, I might get it up in a second. Actually, I've got a drawn version for that I've prepared for this sort of street epistemology. But that's basically where, at least the very early days of Bogosian street epistemology lied, and now we're sort of having these conversations about what really is our objective, because we're not necessarily atheists trying to create atheists, as he outlines this idea in a book called A Manual for Creating Atheists. But we're now moving on, and we're having these very healthy conversations regardless of where we're from. And there's some, I'm sure there's some interesting theists that are also interested in this sort of technique, because they're just as interested as us as to what is true. They just come to a different conclusion. So I find it really interesting to try and map onto the Dunning-Kruger certain ideas. So one of them I was saying to Vern earlier was, when we have the space between the peak of Mount Stupid and there's the slope of enlightenment going to the plateau, you could build a golden bridge that also Bogosian talks about in How to Have Impossible Conversations with James Lindsay. And they talk about golden bridges as in how somebody changes their ideas. So they're going from one island to another, and they need a bridge to cross the path. But we can't put barriers up along the way. We have to clear the debris on the bridge for it to become a golden bridge, for them to pass from one idea to the other as smoothly as possible. And so I've just taken that idea and taken the Dunning-Kruger and put the two together, and then there's a bridge between the mountain and the plateau, where you don't have to have this massive dip to the valley, because that, I hypothesize, is what people are fearing, especially if we go into theistic arguments. We think of, people afraid of the dip in confidence. The world is shattered. I was talking to somebody this week actually who got in touch with me on Twitter, and they standard non-denominational Christian that believes every word of the Bible. And so I was trying to get into some epistemology with them, and I asked, what would you do? How would you feel if God and Jesus just wasn't real and it was proved? And the specific words they used were, "It would shatter me." It is a fascinating piece of psychology. I mean, if it was true for me, it'd be like, oh, all right, we were wrong. Like, it just doesn't bother me if it's all real. I mean, it would be fascinating to know that there's certain parts of logic that we can't trust anymore, like the Trinity, or there's very specific ideas, but it's so fundamental, some of these ideas, to people's identity, which is where it links into the woke, that people are so reluctant to change their mind. And that's what street epistemologists are trying to do. They're trying to encourage people to essentially be comfortable with saying, I don't know.
One of the things I value about the method is that so street epistemology pretty much makes you take your position and try to deduce why you hold why you have such a great deal of confidence in your belief. And the conversation that's had forces you to really dig for foundations as to why you have that belief. And if you don't have those foundations, you quickly realize it. And at that point, I think you see in one way or another what kind of commitment does this person have to to pursuing truth. Like, are they really are they willing? How willing are they willing to go back down to the bottom and start to induct ideas to have a more stable foundation on which to base their ideas. Um, I find it to be a very, very valuable method of having conversations with people, and I've used it pretty successfully against people who are. Well, okay, no, that's a poor way to say it. It's not about being for or against. So strike that. I've used that pretty successfully in conversations with religious and woke individuals, and it's always interesting to see how they react to it because they realize, oh shit, I didn't think about that point before. But what I find also very, very valuable about this is that it also forces you to reconsider some of your own beliefs. One example I'll use is myself, like climate change. This is something I'll freely admit. I believe that there is something wrong with our climate, but if you ask me to believe why I believe it, I am forced myself to say I believe it because of the people I follow and because of the my environment. Like, I can't back up 100% why it exists. I need to go back and re-examine it from ground up to see why this is phenomenal, why it's a concern, and why we need to be worried about it. Street epistemology wise, to illustrate a scale of belief, I think my belief inside there's 6 out of 10. It's I am fairly confident about it, fairly well, okay, moderately confident about it because of the people I follow and because I trust them. But I don't have a foundation for myself, so I'm willing to change my mind in this area, um, depending on the kind of evidence that's being brought my way. Now, having said that, it's not an easy method to be able to use. I really enjoyed Peter's book, How to Create Atheists, and the one he co-wrote with James Lindsay, How to Have Impossible Conversations. But you can't just read a book and say you have confidence in your ability to use the method. Something I've wanted to get involved in for a very, very long time is to find a way to practice it, learn how to direct a conversation using these exact methods in that book. And it's not something you can learn in a day. There's a Discord server out there that allows you to practice with people, which is okay, I guess. But what I really wish was that we had available out there were some people were our coaches that can actually walk you through the method, have you engage in a conversation with someone online, and teach you how to have a conversation, because those dialogues are important as to how we negotiate conversations with people today, especially since we live in such a fragmented atmosphere politically and socially. Learning how to talk to people is something that I think we should have avenues to explore with learning how to develop our conversational skills along these lines. Unfortunately, that kind of resource is not really out there. Like, when you guys say you use it, do you guys really use it to the kind of extent that, say, people like Peter or Anthony or Reed are able to do so? And if not, how do you guys go about developing it? Because I'd be ecstatic if there's some kind of coaching method out there that would, or school that would allow you to practice this. I mean, hell, I'd pay money for it. I think it'd be a great avenue to explore in this kind of environment.
Yes, so allow me to give you euphoria. There is a method, there is a way of trying to find out this information. There are others, I believe, within that specific Discord server on street epistemology that I've been putting together a manual for basically creating modules that you can take, whether they're free or paid, I don't know, but it's definitely Street Epistemology International that are putting it together. And I don't know specifics about it. I don't know whether it's online videos and tutorials, and but there's a number of people that are working on it. And so, yes, that sort of material is now sort of manifesting itself through hours and hours of people's spare time. In terms of what was that second point? I can't remember.
To what degree have you successfully or unsuccessfully used it in your conversations? Because it's not an easy thing to learn.
It is extremely difficult. I mean, when you look at what Reed does, he really strips it back, and he starts to ask the most fundamental question. So it was, I can't think of the example. We were having conversations during our live streams. I've started doing live streams on that Street Epistemology YouTube channel, and they give you 20 minutes talking to any particular random individual. And I believe there's a stream about an hour after this one, in which those conversations are being practiced. And we would talk about, I think it was veganism the other day. I think I was having a conversation with somebody who was arguing that there should be like LGBT education, basically from 10 years of age onwards. And as per Street Epistemology, we don't give our personal opinion, but I think that's reasonable. It's not like, not like some of the examples I'm sure we'll get around to discussing, but it was a question that Reed asked that was, what should be taught and what are the limitations on what can be taught? How do we determine those limitations? It was just such a fundamental question to the conversation. But in terms of the styles and coming up with it, I mean, Peter's currently doing the white tape on the ground, so you can do something in public square with lots of people, and they could all start to they stand on the middle line, which is neutral, and then there's 3 lines of agree, 3 lines of disagree, and varying sort of levels in between. So they strongly agree, slightly agree, or something like that. And I might do something like that in schools, actually, because I've got various different lesson plans that I've got to do. I mean, I'm mainly PE teacher, but I'm left with the class for an afternoon, and we have to fill the time. So it'd be very interesting to get into those sorts of, start a debate club every week, maybe. It's an idea. But the sit-down conversation where you have a desk and, ask me anything, change my mind, whatever poster you have up, and then they get their 20-minute clip videos from that, which they throw out there on YouTube, which are excellent. And everyone should definitely check out what Anthony Magnabosco does and what Reed does on the Cordial Curiosity YouTube channel. And I mean, I'm relatively new to this, but I'm already starting to think about something I was mentioning before we started, and it's going back to Dunning-Kruger. It's asking for their knowledge level. Every street epistemologist asks for the confidence level, but I want to ask what they think is their knowledge level, because when you look at Dunning-Kruger, there's only one line. Actually, sorry, I did actually have it. Should I share it?
Yeah, go for it.
Share screen. Window. I think it's this one. Beautiful. Okay. So a street epistemologist often asks for their confidence level. And so this is rough. This can be debated. As I said earlier, if you know nothing, you have no confidence. You know a little bit, your confidence goes up very sharply compared to the majority of people down at the bottom. Sorry for all the blue rectangles, if you can see that. And then with a very small amount of knowledge, you end up going down into the valley, where anything down as low as 1%, where you still believe, but you're just on your last end, wit's end rather. And then there's a very long, arduous process to get over to here, which is a lot of knowledge from there to there. So if you ask somebody's knowledge level, you're only ever going to get to 1 point on the graph. Whereas if you ask their confidence, and it's 90%, you could hit it there. So let's put it. You could hit there. You could hit there. or there. And they're completely different knowledge levels. So what I find very interesting, as soon as you ask somebody what their knowledge is, then you get a much clearer, what is likely, in my opinion, to be a much more honest answer. If they think they know everything, they're over here. So now you can test their knowledge. If they're over here somewhere, then you could probe them and ask them questions that slips them down to the valley, which is, as I said, taking faith out the strict epistemology equation as Boghossian does. But it's this bit which I'm trying to bridge. I'm trying to avoid this dip. Instead, jump from here to here, if it's possible. If you can keep somebody's confidence high and keep them on a path towards knowledge. Now, they have to be the one that's acquiring this knowledge. I'm not going to, I'm no expert in the 99% of these topics of discussion. But if you can guide them, if you can tutor them in a technique that I'm starting to refer to as knowledge tutoring, then you can use street epistemology, fallacies, biases, whatever it may be, to guide their conversations and guide their curiosity. And then they hopefully, this is at least the idea. I need to test this idea. I need feedback. I need to, get it out there. And that's basically where I'm at concerning coming back to my channel.
Now, when it comes to using street epistemology, like Vernon and I are both bookworms. We talk about like all these books that we research all the time, the ideas brought up by the authors, the data that comes up in the to reinforce the ideas that we study about and read. When it comes to street epistemology, do you feel like to use it effectively, you have to be further along the x-axis in the graph to really be able to be an effective street epistemologist? Because you have to have a degree of knowledge that allows you to ask incisive questions as to how to explore someone's level of belief. I'm not claiming you have to be an absolute expert, but you have to have some depth to have a conversation with somebody who to really investigate their depth of belief.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm going to be referring to such a thing as tutoring, we are essentially tutoring. So yeah, you would have to be at least ahead of where they are in the conversation. You don't have to necessarily be ahead. You could be in line, and we can say, hey, we both don't know this. Where might we go to try and find out this information? What sources should we go to? Why should we go to those sources? Should we go to multiple sources? How do we verify this information? But yeah, you couldn't be behind them. So you would have to have a more advanced understanding, in my opinion, of flaws in reasoning, aka fallacies, and everything I've written about. But then again, I would say that. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just saying that out of whatever it be called. I'm just having a self-serving bias, perhaps, and I'm saying, well, maybe. I mean, maybe I'm also, on the flip side, because I am questioning my own thoughts, it sort of shows that I am at least competent to some extent. But I would start with that. I would understand epistemology. I would understand reasoning and get things wrong, and that's okay. Examine your own ideas. What's wonderful about the Street Epistemology YouTube channel is that you can be the epistemologist and you can be the guest they're interviewing. So you can put forward a claim of your own, and you can come forward and get put on your ass, and that's great, because you have to at least get to the point that we have, which is understanding that it's bloody brilliant to have your ass put on the floor, because then you can improve and you can learn. And I don't want to end up in 10 years, and I write this explicitly in the intro to the second book, Brilliant Biases, where I say we all have ideas 10 years ago that we are embarrassed by, that we used to hold. And it's not just we were wrong, we were actually embarrassed to even admit that we, thought that the sun was a ball of fire. Like, we didn't quite understand that it doesn't have the oxygen, it's a different process kind of thing. And then we have to apply that very simple piece of logic and say, in 10 years' time, we're going to look back to today and we're going to be just as embarrassed as we are now about 10 years ago. And so if there was a process that we can undergo where we can find out more about what those ideas are, because everybody believes what they believe now is right. Nobody thinks, oh, something in my brain is wrong. Although they might question, hopefully they'd question it and say, well, maybe my knowledge level isn't so high, so my confidence level isn't so high. Those are the people that are already on the journey, but the majority of people aren't there yet.
What I've noticed is that, especially in this day and age, a lot of people do have knowledge, a considerable amount of knowledge about their own position. So let's say someone is very supportive of Black Lives Matter, right? And let's get the brightest person that we can find on the street who was marching down after the Floyd protest. They probably, and again, this would be the smartest example, they probably have a lot of data memorized that supports their arguments, whether that means studies to show that Black people are less likely to get pulled over at night once it's more difficult to notice that they are Black. They can probably, get a lot of memorized arguments. If not memorized, maybe they thought through it, but that knowledge really is only limited towards their particular side. If you were to ask them, well,
Yeah.
what would the smartest person who disagrees with you say? What would be their arguments? Not your characterization of their arguments, but what would they themselves say? You can call Ben Shapiro a racist, but I don't think Ben Shapiro would tell you I am against Black Lives Matter because I am a racist. And that's where they crumble. And so this is, I'm sure there's a large, if not exclusively, component of tribalism there, where people are subconsciously more interested in attending to their tribe and belonging to a particular group. But that's not something anybody would ever want to admit. Even though that happens, no one ever actively says, I believe this just because my tribe believes it and I want to fit in. That's what's happening, but nobody would admit that. So as soon as, hopefully, in my mind, as soon as they realize, and they look like they have egg on their face, that they really don't know much about the other side of the argument. And they'll say, I am interested in figuring out the truth. I'm not interested in lying to myself just so I could appease this group. Intellectually, they can distinguish between those two things and want to actually advance the conversation and believe what is true. Once they come to that conclusion intellectually, and they've outed themselves as clearly not understanding the other side, hopefully that's where there's a change. And that's what I've tried to do in my conversations. When it comes to people that I talk to in person, the way that I try to engage those conversations, especially when it's a controversial subject, is I first sort of hear out their general arguments, right? Because obviously when you talk to someone for the first time and you're talking about something like this, they probably don't have a good introduction on how to have these conversations. So it's probably just going to be some scattershot arguments. So I'm patient with that. But then I sort of, once I get an idea of what their arguments are and where they're coming from, I sort of ask them, what would someone who disagrees with you say? And the vast majority of the time, it is a characterization, a very poor one and a very disingenuous one. And then I'll try to, because I'm not trying to debate them. Many of these times, 99% of the times, it's just people telling me their opinions, right? So I try to make sure, and this goes back to what I was originally saying about how I've noticed street epistemology is effective on like half the people that use it on. So I try to present a semi-strong argument. So I remember I did this with cancel culture when someone said that cancel culture is accountability culture. And then I asked them, well, someone who disagrees with you, what would they say? Because obviously, no one is saying that the reason they're against cancel culture is because they don't want people to be held accountable for their actions. Of course they do. And so their response was, well, I'm sure it's because they just don't agree with the reasons for why they're canceled, which is a big part of it. Yeah, a lot of the arguments against cancel culture is that the reasoning is poor. But then I brought in sort of the strongest argument against cancel culture that I've heard, which came from Alex O'Connor. I won't take credit for it, in which he basically said that the issue with cancel culture, a big part of it, is the fact that it ignores the principle that we should stand by, that the punishment should be in proportion to the crime. And if someone tweeted out something stupid a couple of years ago, before they were 18 even, something racist, is the punishment of blasting them through the worlds, advertising what they did, embarrassing them in front of millions of people, how on earth is that punishment proportionate to what they did? It's not. And most of the issues with cancel culture is pretty much that. The only way you could justify cancel culture on those grounds would be if we're looking at someone like Kevin Spacey or Harvey Weinstein. But the vast majority of people who are canceled are not Kevin Spacey, they're not Harvey Weinstein. And so when I presented that argument, that was the first time that I actually saw a glimmer of hope in the future of humanity, where they realized that maybe I should sort of um, reanalyze and recalibrate my mode of thinking. Now, that doesn't happen most of the time, and I'm not saying I would never make the claim that I'm a paragon of diplomacy and that I know how to deal with these situations 100%. Because I'm sure if someone did the same exact thing to me, in which a belief that I'm very staunchly and arrogantly confident about, sure, I'd also end up with egg on my face. But that's what I've tried to do with these conversations that I've had in person, because, as I said, these conversations are becoming more and more common. Just a couple of years ago, you probably would have never known someone's opinion on abortion or Black Lives Matter or social justice, because it would have never been brought up. But now it's brought up all the time, and so I'm forcing myself to try to figure out how to navigate that, because I don't want to debate, and I don't want to I don't want to debate in the context of just seeing someone for the first time or talking to someone in person and it's an impromptu debate. I sort of just want to make sure that I try to understand their beliefs and see if they understand theirs. But that's pretty much what I've been doing. Hopefully it's effective, but I'm not quite sure. Um, Dave, how do you sort of go about these conversations in person? Is there a difference between the way that you engage with your local community versus the way you do so online, with people who basically consent to already having these conversations?
So yeah, just to clarify, I've never done like a sit down in the street, ask me anything kind of read nice wonder style of shit epistemology. I've always done it online. It's always been through those sorts of mediums where you can't really see each other. So you're well aware of the way I operated on my podcast and the way I go about asking questions. I don't try to hide any particular bias, but at the same time, I try and play devil's advocate, and I try and at least get people to say I don't know, which is essentially what a street epistemologist does. And so I think in the past few years over the pandemic, I've had a very stressful time of being trying to be sued by those aforementioned gentlemen, and that's one way of putting it, and various other incidents that have happened. And as such, I'm trying to become more consciously aware of how to fast track a conversation. So when I speak with the children I teach, after a certain age, they start to talk back, and I try as best as I can, using the methods that I've outlined in my books as a guide, to try to guide the conversation in a curious manner. I think I've successfully taught myself to ask lots of questions in that moment. So a very simple example would be a tu quoque fallacy. So that would be you two, or rather I think the better example would be a whataboutery. So they're saying, if I'm accusing one kid of doing a particular thing and they shouldn't be behaving like that, they will turn around and say, well, they did. Well, doesn't matter, right? So I have to somehow communicate with that child to make them, get them to understand, even if that other person did a terrible, terrible thing, does that mean that you are allowed to do a bad thing that isn't as bad as what they did? And this best works with a crowd, actually, come to think of it. So if you're asking this and you're with a group of kids, they get that peer review aspect as well. So typically at that age they're just so sweet and innocent, sort of 8, 9, 10 years of age, where they've just started to get a bit more independent and they can speak confidently out loud and they do talk back to you. But when you end up having a group that you can answer that question and say, does it, are you allowed to behave like that even if no adult's watching, or whatever it may be? And you usually get a chorus of no, which is great, because then they're the outcast. What's really difficult is when you don't have that group, because you can have a one-to-one with these people. The problem is when they're the majority or a sufficient number within the group, which then makes them sort of gang out as a group. And so if you've got 3 or 4, typically it's always year 5, so they're usually 9 or 10, and they're boys. They're always boys, and they end up coming forward with just not even an argument, really. They're just completely dismissing you from, it's as if you don't exist, and you're asking them to do something, and none of them want to be the first person to do it, because that's seen as weakness by the rest of the group. And I don't think I've fully worked out exactly what is the best way to address that. But it's something along the lines of trying to get them into a reasoned conversation. So mention people they don't like and say, what if they behave like that? What should I do as the grown-up? It got to the point where we did, over the course of the past few weeks, I've been running these summer camps, still very fresh in my mind. I should say the wounds, the scars are still fresh, and it's usually dodgeball. That's a very frantic sport. Nobody wants to admit that they're out, that they got hit, and except it's blindingly obvious when they were out, and they shout and they scream. And so when we try and reason with them, you get this standoff of, no, I wasn't, and they just carry on. So instead, we make them the official, the referee. And so you take one from each team, and they get their special seat in front of you, and you decide, right, I'm not going to say anything for this game. I'm just going to make notes on who was out and what you missed. And they find out that actually it's way worse when they're doing it, because they miss so much. They're not clear enough. They're not being strict enough to the rules. They're not adhering to somebody who's clearly crossing the line, which you're not allowed to do, as you're meant to stay in your half. So you eventually have to put them into the scenario, right? Now, how that applies to adults, how do you get people to empathize? How do you, as I made a note earlier on something you said. Yeah, how do you get people to value the truth more than their reputation? Like, are they willing to lose their reputation for the sake of the truth? How much does truth really matter to them? I don't quite know whether this is the right answer, but you have to make them dependent on the truth, or at least make them realize that they are, because they already are. So this is why people think that people get more conservative when they get older. They don't. They just get a greater level of responsibility. So when you've got no responsibility and you're young and you're running around and you don't have that care for others, much like how you then make them the referee, make them, stay in charge of the game. They then have some responsibility, and it wakes them up very quickly. And so you have to do that with people as well. With adults. Of course, children are people. But to conclude this little diatribe, I think ultimately you have to let adults, through our own values of, freedom of speech, democracy, liberty, be in charge. And they should hopefully realize that, I actually know nothing about nuclear energy. I know nothing about how to farm the food that I eat. I have no idea how, it might be the claim that all straight white men are useless, except as far as I'm aware, the main argument being made against that is that the energy, or the oil pipelines, the buildings, the skyscrapers, that's majority all put together by men who are risking their lives in some instances to get all this stuff that you are dependent on. I have absolutely no idea what the question was, but I don't know if that helps.
I need to take off in about 5 minutes. So I might leave this a little bit early, but going along the point that you spoke here, David, about how to value truth, and not necessarily the value of your reputation. That kind of leads into the idea of why we're so tribalized today, because most of us are, and I myself included, are victim to our natures. We want to believe what the dominant group believes it to be the truth, but to move forward into the future, for in the world with the kind of technology and the good or bad that can come from that advancement, we have to value truth more than ideology. And how do we get there? One of the things I wanted to ask both of you today: have you guys ever read Julia Galef's The Scout Mindset?
I haven't.
No.
Okay, so that book, she gives a. I really encourage everyone who's listening to this, including you two, to pick up that book, because she talks about epistemology in that, in her writings, about how you can have two mindsets to the truth. Someone who's a scout, someone like from military context, you send someone out there to chart the terrain, to verify, let's talk about this from a war scenario. You want to send a scout out there to verify the strength of the enemy forces. You want to see what the terrain is like. You want to see if there's a bridge here. You want to see what the weather's like, all that kind of stuff. And the scout begins with an initial map of what he or she thinks the land looks like. But when he actually goes out there, his responsibility is to go out and to readjust the map, redraw it according to what he actually observes and finds. That's a scout. That's how someone should approach truth in their daily lives. If you have a defensive mindset, your goal is not to redraw the lines. Your goal is to make sure everything stays put the way they are. So those are two entirely different approaches to epistemology. And most of us, because we're clustered into tribes, we're not concerned about being scouts. We're concerned about being soldiers. In that context, so it's a really, really interesting concept to build upon the idea that we need to get away from tribalism, and start pursuing truth. why do we need to pursue truth? Because the truth informs actions, and actions have consequences. But this is not an easy thing to pursue, because I think because our biological natures, our evolutionary psychology primes us for groupthink, not necessarily for the mentality of the scout. It's being able to move from point A to point B is really going to determine like how we move forward as a species in the later part of the 21st century.
Yeah, how do we make people not just appreciate the scout, as you put it, but how do we make them? They're already dependent on the scouts. They have to make them realize how much more dependent than they realize they are. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I'd have to think about that. Yeah, I don't know.
Try to pick up the book and read it. I thought it was fairly interesting. Julia has a number of lectures on YouTube, I believe, in which she talks about this. She does give some clues and ideas on how to approach the scout mind, how to get yourself into the scout mindset. But as for having conversations and for having actual techniques to actually put yourself on the scout mindset road, I still think that the manual for creating atheists and how to have impossible conversations is probably the best way to go, because I've read a lot of books that teach you how to try to teach you how to have great conversations. Like one of the ones I read earlier this year was written by someone who I enjoyed seeing her posts online. A book by Monica Guzman. I don't remember the name of her book. It's like I never thought about it that way. The book was, I thought it was okay, but it didn't really lay out a step-by-step process as to how to approach having a very, very hard conversation. It was very, very general. That's why I'm a fan of the books put out by Peter and James, because you're actually given tangible techniques and ideas, not just to employ in your conversations, but it's impossible to use them without having them use on yourself first. Because you have to have a certain level of knowledge in order to engage in these conversations. And once the questions start leaving your mouth, you can't ask them without asking yourself them first. And you'll discover which one of your beliefs have no foundation at all, have some foundation, but could use a little bit more research, and which of your beliefs actually have that step-by-step A to B linkage that have very few gaps. Those are the beliefs you can have a fair amount of confidence in. So the techniques outlined in street epistemology are a good guide as to how to approach truth, but how to get people to value it on a tribal or group basis, that's the challenge. And with that said, gentlemen, I need to pick up a little bit early, so
here.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think it's a good place to end the podcast, end this conversation. Lovely, fascinating conversation with, of course, the illustrious David Worley. Dave, where can people find you?
Oh, they can. We'll throw the link down into the description. I'm sure the link tree. I'll find that for you.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and put everything down there. Yeah.
Yeah, mainly you can find me on Twitter at FallacyDave. I will also be on Discord at FallacyDave as well. I may have to add that to the link tree. And I also will be on YouTube still as David Worley. You can email me. I'm always up for these conversations and these streams and that sort of thing. So I'm desperate to have more of these conversations with such illustrious people as yourselves. So yeah, basically those, and I think that's about it. All that I might throw out there is that I really appreciate being on. I hope we can eventually get round to having a conversation about a potential third book, because I'm still thinking about that, and so yeah, I'm still trying to go over various different arguments, throw some untouched fallacies and biases out there, and try to go over some very specific arguments and some very specific pieces of sophistry, which I think people will come across quite often, but don't necessarily know how to react to. So instead of me saying, here's a straw man, as I think Bill Meyer did a bit last night on Real Time about that, I can now say, here's the ontological argument from Saint Anselm, and you can go through it and pick apart the reasons and the premises.
Yeah, sounds great. We're excited for that. So everyone, have a good day, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.